to Trump! Stand up to Trump! Stand up to Trump! Stand up to Trump! Stand up to Trump!
Hello and welcome to Power and Politics. I'm Catherine Cullen. Vashi is away today. We are streaming live around the world on the CBC News app and CBCNews.ca. I'd like to welcome viewers joining us on CBC Television from the Maritime provinces. Great to have you with us. And you showed up at just the right time because it is time for the Power Panel. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau participated in the anti-racism demonstration in Ottawa today. Some people cheered him while others chanted what you just heard in that clip: stand up to Trump. Trudeau also took a knee while listening to the speakers. The Prime Minister said earlier today that work must start now to combat systemic racism. Do the comments of our political leaders match their actions when it comes to addressing racism and systemic discrimination? We are going to ask the Power Panel in Winnipeg today. Nigan Sinclair, Associate Professor in the Department of Native Studies at the University of Manitoba and a columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press. Vicky Machama, she is the Culture Society and Critical Race Editor at The Conversation in Toronto. And Emily Nicolas is a columnist with Le Devoir. She joins us from Montreal. So welcome to all of you. Vicky, I want to start with you. I want to hear what your reaction is to the Prime Minister coming out, listening to speakers in the march in Ottawa today and taking a knee.
This isn't the first time that we've seen the Prime Minister join or attend a protest. You know, famously, he attended one of the climate strike protests in Montreal last year. He also, at the Canada 150, when there was a substantial protest, pro-Indigenous protest on the Hill, he also attended and went to them. But what we're seeing from him is a willingness to convey political messaging that suggests that he accepts the messages and the criticisms of protesters, while his government is either slow or behind or really unwilling to engage with the criticisms that protesters are making. And in some of them, he is very, very behind. Obviously, on the Indigenous issue, there's substantial issues. But on anti-Black racism, I don't know that we've seen this Prime Minister really step up to what he says to his beliefs. Obviously, the blackface photos surfaced some concerns about his views on racism, but we still haven't heard a full hearing from this Prime Minister or his government about what it is that they plan to do around anti-Black racism that's within their power. So he's very skilled at the political messaging, but very, very poor or unclear on what he plans to do politically.
He has been pressed over the course of the last couple of days, Vicky, about some questions surrounding policing specifically. Defunding police. Today he was asked questions about body cameras and whatnot. I wonder where you would like to hear him go that is further than he has been going thus far.
Well, I would like to hear questions answered around the immigration file, where we know that there's systemic anti-Black racism, on how even if people are coming in as tourists, that they experience anti-Black racism. I would like to hear him expand on how it is he's going to ensure that the RCMP, for example, and CBSA and other enforcement agencies under the federal government's agency and under their power will plan to ensure that their governments are functioning with an equity lens, if not an anti-racism lens. And if he plans to defund or diminish the role of the carceral state under federal corrections. These are questions that he needs to be pressed on. It's not just a matter of saying that he supports Black Lives Matter or he believes in anti-racism or that he understands that anti-racism is real. Of course it's real. That's not a question. The question is, what does he plan to do about it that's very, very specific?
Emily, I want to bring you in to talk just a bit more about what we saw when the Prime Minister stepped out into the crowd today, because obviously there was some resistance, some people applauding him for coming out, but other people who were shouting, stand up to Trump, that is something that they would like to see from the Prime Minister. Of course, we've all talked at great length about his 21-second pause when he was asked what message it sends that he doesn't speak out against Donald Trump, and then the Prime Minister talked about what was happening in Canada. I wonder, how concerned are you? What do you make of his refusal to directly condemn Donald Trump?
Well, I'd like to start by echoing what Vicky was saying in terms of Trump being, not Trump, Trudeau being in the habit of protesting himself. And Greta Thunberg's reaction to that was to be very much unimpressed. And I think the least we can do as Canadians is to be as equally unimpressed with that as Greta Thunberg was back in October with the same kind of gesture. I think it's complicated for him politically to speak directly about Trump because Trump could push, any button of consequences for Canada. And I think I understand that. At the same time, The problem is not whether or not he's speaking about Trump. The fact is he's not saying anything at all besides "I hear you and I feel you." Would it be on the U.S. issues or on the Canadian issues? And so we've heard as well from the Minister of Diversity and Inclusion the same kind of message of "We hear you, we're going to speak with you." The thing is, those conversations have been going on for a long time, and I think people need to know that when, for example, Canadian Heritage, now under this new Minister for Diversity and Inclusion, usually do consultation. What they do is that they very carefully select the people who are going to be invited to that conversation so that the voices that they don't want to hear, the people who might rock the boat a little bit more, don't necessarily get an invitation. So there's never been a consultation on systemic racism in the last years led by the Canadian government where all people are actually invited. It's very much a by invite only kind of conversation. So that's something that needs to change as well. But even in those kind of conversations, there's already recommendation out there. There's definitely things that can be done, as Vicky was saying, in terms of correctional services. There's definitely a lot of things that need to be done in terms of relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Crown. There's a lot to be done as well in terms of how do we not have this issue of systemic racism going on within the government itself, with Black employees, people of color not being able to access certain kind of leadership role. And so the issues are numerous. And I think beyond the words, I think people want to see action very swiftly. People are also not going to be satisfied with the same kind of very nice, small piece reform that we've been used to be promised in the last years. When people are talking about defunding the police, or people are talking about radically changing the way that the police operate, it's based on the fact that the police has been doing things wrong for the last 150 years. And it's not just a couple of switches or tweaking their methods is going to make a huge difference in the way that Black people and Indigenous people in their lives in this country live their lives and their relationship with the police.
Again, I want to bring you in here. The Prime Minister today saying change has been happening at too gradual a pace, that he is saying that it needs to happen more quickly. And I wonder, when you take into account, on the one hand, what the Prime Minister is saying, but at the same time, what is happening right now in terms of the broader national conversation, how much optimism do you have for some substantial change?
Well, I think this Prime Minister, if anything, knows exactly what to say in the right moment. However, the problem, of course, is that the institutions that he works and oversees don't tend to follow the very words that the Prime Minister says, which indicates that there's a distance between the Prime Minister and institutions, particularly policing in this country, and then also on top of that with the provincial governments. So in most cases, the provincial governments are those who are most aggressively pursuing agendas, that institutions that indemnify many of these racist acts. And I'm thinking particularly in Alberta right now with the passing of legislation that will ban protests. But I'm also thinking of the ways municipal governments aren't operating. So I think sometimes that the Prime Minister is also doing this funny dance of having to convince people within institutions that he oversees, but then also trying to convince other leaders within Canada that this is how a statesperson should operate. And I also think it's in direct relation to the absolute anarchy that is happening south of the border, in terms of the leader of the United States being so acrimonious and so dictator-like in relationship to particularly these protests in the United States, that I think he's trying to posture, but then also no change happens as a result.
I want to ask you as well, not only about the words of the Prime Minister, but the words of Indigenous Services Minister Mark Miller. He was asked today about two violent incidents involving Indigenous people. What was supposed to be a well-being check on a woman in New Brunswick who was ultimately shot by police, as well as an instance where a man in Nunavut was hit by a police cruiser. And he had a very strong reaction today. If we have that clip.
Frankly, along with many Canadians, Indigenous peoples living in Canada, politicians, I'm pissed, I'm outraged. There needs to be a full accounting of what has gone on. This is a pattern that keeps repeating itself.
I mean, I feel like I'm repeating myself asking if you're encouraged by that.
What I would say is that, in the opening days of the pandemic, 3 Indigenous peoples were shot here in Winnipeg. And if there's any indication of the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the policing, and then also other racialized people, we are about 1 hour from a Black Lives Matter gathering at the Manitoba Legislature, and the police have already issued tear gas warnings for those downtown. Now, Winnipeg is not known for its peaceful protests, peaceful gatherings, and so it's perhaps indicative of the larger problem of policing in the country and the ways in which policing both gather and approach protests in a very divisive and combative fashion. And I think it's indicative of a government that really is operating at a much different level or a much different sensibility anyways. The words are all nice, but there's no change. And what that indicates to you is that inclusion, cultural awareness training, other things that seem to be indicating change really are not change. And ultimately what we have is a large-scale problem with education, ignorance, and then general racism within the very institutional leadership of the country.
Okay, Vicky, I want to come back around to you. I mean, I think we're hearing a bit of a consensus across this edition of the Power Panel that it's a lot more words than actions. So you talked about some of the actions that you would like to see. I wonder, are there things for you that are at the top of the list, or that you feel that the levels of government, be it federal, municipal, provincial, are more likely to take action on right now as this public pressure grows?
Well, I think right now there's both a public pressure, but there's also pressure on governments to take action around the pandemic. And what I've heard speaking to Black people working in the health services is that there's very little being done in terms of outreach to their communities to ensure that people are feeling comfortable about getting the COVID-19 test, that have access to the COVID-19 test, that feel comfortable that when they enter those institutions that they can access the health services that they need, or if they're now beginning to say open up, they can access the help that's needed. I think what we're seeing here is 2 layers of crisis for Black communities. One is the health crisis that has always existed, as well as the policing crisis that has already existed. In the midst of this pandemic, instead of serving Black communities, we've empowered the police. And I think that creates a real danger and a real set of hazards. And this is something that every single level of government must come together at a table with Black community leaders and really think about the choices that they've made over the last 3 months and wonder if that has had a negative impact on Black communities. Because from what I've heard in talking to people is that they feel left out, they feel ignored, and they feel unsafe and unsure. And when they feel that way at a time when they're feeling, grieving as a community, there are real dangers here for our communities, as well as the economic impact that's happening right now. And so we have a large-scale crisis within the Black community. I've talked many times about we're experiencing 2 different pandemics, and the Black community is experiencing a pandemic of intense risk at a time where money is being spent, but not necessarily on them. Lots of talk is happening, but not necessarily in their direction. And there's not a lot of care being given to what Black communities needed. And that's not without the ask, like Emily pointed out, there are recommendations that precede this very moment. And so governments need to really open up the archives, talk to Black community leaders, talk to Black activists, and not be afraid of doing so. And be clear about what their intentions are towards the Black community. And it goes the same for our media institutions, to hold them to account, to make sure that they're serving Black communities in these moments of crisis.
Yeah, Emily, to what extent do you believe that is likely to happen, what Vicky's talking about there? Not only obviously the media, but the public institutions as well. I mean, you talked about opening up consultations as well. Do you feel that we're at a moment right now where that is a possibility?
I don't know, but I know 2 things. There are 2 issues that have been pressed long before the crisis exploded in the U.S. That still haven't been answered. The first one is the issue of collecting race-based data for this pandemic. This is something that people have been pressuring, because if you don't know who's dying, you don't know who's more affected by it, you don't know how to respond the most effectively to this crisis. I was just hearing before we came on about this she session and people being able to acknowledge with no problem that this crisis is affecting women the most, but it's been a very long battle for Canadians to acknowledge that this pandemic affects Black people also the most. And it's definitely the case in Montreal, and Montreal is the center of this epidemic in Canada. And the second thing is, asylum seekers. They've been essential workers. The people who've been crossing the U.S. border, coming to Canada in 2017 after the election of Trump, many of them are now working with our elders in Montreal, and they don't have status. People have been asking for them to have status. We still don't have a clear answer from the Prime Minister, from Justin Trudeau, that the people, mostly of Haitian origin, who are essential workers in Montreal, will be getting status, will be getting permanent residency as a result of their service to this country in this time of a warlike effort. And we just learned as well from the Premier in Quebec, François Legault, that he's planning to ban actually those asylum seekers from being able to join the training necessary to become workers in our elderly homes. So because people have been pressuring for them to receive status because they're essential workers, Legault is trying to block them from being essential workers. So that's going on right now, and I think leadership from Justin Trudeau would be very welcome in this time, not just silences and taking a knee, actual answers and action.
Nigan, we have a moment left. I'd like to hear what you're looking for.
Yeah, well, I mean, we actually have race-based data involving the pandemic here in Manitoba, and so there's a really innovative process that's begun with the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs and the province of Manitoba involving keeping race-based data in terms of the pandemic for Indigenous communities. And so we've seen that as a very successful way in which we're able to track the disease and then also be able to prevent it. And we are noticing out of that data, even though it's race-based, that we're noticing that women are more affected by the disease as well. And so I think that's an important indication. But what I'm really interested in looking at is not so much in terms of the way institutions, we clearly know that there's a problem in institutions. There needs to be edicts brought in that not just involving cultural awareness training, but employment targets and also massive amounts of retraining within upper management. I'm not talking about base level. I'm talking about upper management peoples who are in leadership positions in order to cure this endemic of racism within institutional leadership. But what I would say is that I'm actually interested in community leadership. Like, for example, about an hour from now, I said that there's a Black Lives Matter gathering here in Winnipeg. They have asked the police not to attend, which is remarkable. Of course, the police are going to show up anyways. They've already announced that they're going to refuse that edict and then come and be at that gathering. But they've asked for local Indigenous community-led groups like the Bear Clan, like the Mama Bear Clan, to be able to provide crowd servicing and crowd support in order for this gathering to take place. What that tells you is that there's ally building amongst Indigenous and Black communities right here in Winnipeg, also throughout the country, that is being well and beyond than it depending on institutions and governments to do so.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there, but I thank all three of you for your time today. Nigan Sinclair, Vicky Mochama, and Emily Nicolas. Thank you all.
Miigwech, thank you.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.